assign a value to it, and then these errors will go away. So what this for loop is going to do is to calculate the square root of a series of numbers starting with number 2, and then it will calculate, so it will calculate the square root of number 2, and then it will print it to the screen, and I'll talk about NSLog in a minute. Then it will add 1 to square, so it'll make square 3, and then it will calculate the square root of 3, and then it will add 1 to 3 and make square root 4, and it will keep on doing this until this integer variable here is equal to or less than 20. So once it gets to 21, this condition will not be met and the looping will cease. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is, well, usually you will use an integer value, give it any name you want. So you can call it accumulator, you can call it anything you want. You have to assign a value to it, and usually it's 1, but it can be another number. This is the conditional statement here. So as long as the accumulator integer is equal to or less than 20, the loop will continue. Okay. After the first time it's gone through, accumulator will be incremented by 1. And this here is just shorthand, really, for saying accumulator plus 1. Okay. So after the first loop through, this will increment accumulator to being 2. Then this conditional statement will be checked. Is accumulator less than or equal to 20? Well, it's 2, so yes it is. So all of these statements will be executed. After that, accumulator gets incremented to 3. Is accumulator less than or equal to 20? Yes, it is. So all of this code is executed again. So it just keeps on looping around until, in this case, it gets to 21 and it will stop. Okay. Now the reason I put int square equals 2 outside of the for loop is so that this stays the same. Okay. If we put int square equals 2 in here, when it came back the second time, it would be reset to 2 and it would never increase. Okay, it would always be being reset back to 2. Okay. So the first time through, this integer here, square root, equals square multiplied by square, so 2 times 2. Then we print the result of this to the console, which is this section down here. If you remember, we can toggle this on and off by doing that. Okay, and you can move this up and down. Now this NSLog is a function that allows you to print information to this section here. So it takes as its argument a string variable, which is exactly the same as what we've seen up here. So you can use all the same formatting. So the square root of %i equals %i, and then you have the two variables here, square and square root. Okay. And then finally we increment square by 1, so it will become 3. So the next time it goes through, it will be 3 times 3, and it'll put that multiplication into this variable here and then print it to the console, and then it'll be incremented by 1, so it'll be 4, and it will continue to do that until accumulator gets to 21, and then it will stop. Okay, so we're putting it in view_did_load so that it does this for loop immediately the application is launched. So let's run it and see what happens. Okay, so we'll just get rid of this for the moment because we're interested in this down here. Okay, so the first run through the loop, the square root of 2 equals 4. So that's correct. So then it has incremented square to 3. The square root of 3 equals 9. And as you can see, 2, 3, 4, 5, this has worked. Now because we set accumulator as 1, okay, there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, so there's 20 there, which is what we wanted. If we had set this to 0, then we would have this one as the final one. Okay, so that's a for loop, and it's a very quick way of doing things like this, where you want to do some calculation over and over and over and over again, and you may have to do this calculation thousands of times, and you don't want to have to write out this line and this line thousands of times. Okay, so a for loop is a very common way of doing that. Okay, so that's looping. There are other ways of looping. There are while statements and do statements, and they do similar things, but for now we'll just concentrate on the for loop. Okay, so finally we're going to create our own class. Okay. Now, this method here, you see NSString, string with format. NSString is a class. Okay, so the class of NSString, you can see over here, the NSString class declares the programmatic interface for an object that manages immutable strings. So strings that cannot be changed. Okay, so the class defines the characteristics of a particular object. In this case, it's a string, and we know that strings are things like this, words and characters. And this, string with format, is a method within the class of NSString. And in this case, this particular method allows us to combine words and numbers. But in the NSString class, there are literally hundreds of methods for manipulating string objects. So putting words together, taking them apart, counting the number of characters, you name it, you can pretty much do it with string variables. Okay, so we haven't had to write this method ourselves. Apple wrote this method for us, and we haven't had to write this class. Apple have done that for us, but we can do it ourselves. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you how to create your own class, and then use methods to access, to set and access variables within that class. So what we need to do is go to File, New File. In this case, we want iOS, Cocoa Touch, and we want Objective-C class. So make sure that one is selected, and then hit the Next button. And we need to give it a name, so let's just call it My Class, and leave this at NSObject. Next, and then hit the Create button. So now we have two files, myclass.h and myclass.m, and they are blank. Now within my class, we're going to define some instance variables. So after it says NSObject, have a space, and then type an open curly brackets, and then return. Do that a couple of times, and it will automatically put the closed curly brackets in. Now we're going to define two what we call instance variables, and the first one is an integer for your age, so we'll call it my age, and the second one is going to be an NSString object called my name. Now something that you need to be aware of that is different between these two is you notice that this one, the string, has a star. Okay, there's no star in between here. Now this actually defines what's called a pointer. But for all intents and purposes, what this means is you are creating an NS string object. Okay, and that's where, in the language of Objective-C, the object bit comes from. You are creating an object. You are creating a string object called myName. Now, after the curly brackets, what we're going to do is define our methods. And the first one is going to be a method that sets the age. So I'll type them out and then explain what's happening. So in this case, this first method here, the name of the method says it all really. This method will allow you to set a value for this variable here, myAge. Now in this case, this method has what's called an argument, which is this section here. So in other words, it allows you to input a value, and that value that value has to be an integer data type. And the value that you type in will be temporarily allocated into this variable here called age. Okay. This bit here, the void, simply means that it doesn't return an object, or it doesn't return a value. Okay, and when I explain this, it will make more sense. So in this case here, this is what's called the setter. Okay, so this is the setter. This allows you to set the value of an instance variable. This here simply returns the value that is stored in this integer variable. Okay, so this is called the getter, because we are simply getting, this method simply allows us to get the value inside this variable. Okay, and it returns an integer value because this instance variable is an integer. There is an integer stored in this. So when we call this method, it will return an integer value. Okay, and we can do the same for the name. So void, it doesn't return anything. We're calling it set name, and in this case it takes an NS string as its argument. Okay, so we're doing exactly the same now, but for this instance variable here. So this method will allow us to set the value of this object, which is the NS string object, by passing in this argument here. Okay, so this method expects you to pass in a string object, otherwise it will give you an error. So if when we run this method, if we typed in a number, it would give us a warning. Okay, so the data type that is being passed in as this argument has to be a string. And then that will allow us to set the name, set this NS string to whatever string value we pass in here. This one is the getter. It will simply give us back an NS string object that is stored in